This is the story of the American Revolution, a conflict that gave birth to a nation, transformed empires, and redefined the very meaning of freedom. Welcome to Fall Asleep too. If long, gentle journeys through history, philosophy, and the stars bring you comfort, consider subscribing so you'll always have another story waiting. Now, get comfortable, let the world grow quiet, and let's get started. Long before the first shot was fired at Lexington, the American Revolution was already quietly brewing. It began not with musket fire, but with policies, taxes, and debates that rippled across the 13 colonies. To understand the revolution, we must begin decades earlier, in the aftermath of another war, the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. This conflict, which lasted from 1754 to 1763, pitted the British Empire and its American colonies against the French and their Native American allies. The war ended in British victory, and with it, the acquisition of vast new territories in North America. But war is expensive. The British government, deeply in debt, looked to its colonies for revenue. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It required colonists to pay a tax on every piece of printed paper they used: newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, even dice. Though the tax itself was modest, it ignited a firestorm. For many colonists, the issue was not the amount, but the principle. They had no representation in Parliament, and thus no voice in the laws being imposed on them. No taxation without representation became a rallying cry. Across the colonies, protests erupted. In Boston, a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty took to the streets. They intimidated tax collectors, destroyed stamped paper, and hung effigies in protest. Merchants organised boycotts of British goods. The resistance was so effective that the Stamp Act was repealed just a year later. But the victory was short-lived. The British government passed a series of new laws, including the Townshend Acts of 1767, which placed duties on imported goods like glass, tea, and paper. Again, colonists resisted. Again, tensions flared. And again, Boston became the epicenter of protest. In 1770, British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. 5 colonists were killed. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, often remembered as the first casualty of the Revolution. The incident shocked the colonies and was quickly used as propaganda by revolutionaries. Tensions calmed temporarily, but they never truly disappeared. In 1773, the British East India Company was granted the exclusive right to export tea to America, effectively creating a monopoly. Colonists saw this as another unjust move. In response, a group of Bostonians, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the sea. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, was a bold act of defiance. In retaliation, the British government passed the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. They closed Boston Harbor, dissolved local governments, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England. Far from intimidating the colonists, these measures unified them. In 1774, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They issued a Declaration of Rights and organised a boycott of British goods. But more importantly, they began to see themselves not as separate colonies, but as a collective people with shared grievances and a common cause. The seeds of rebellion had taken root, and soon they would bear fruit in the form of open conflict. By early 1775, tensions between Britain and the colonies had reached a boiling point. The colonies were bristling with indignation, and militias across New England began to organise and train. British officials in America, especially General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, saw the colonies as slipping beyond their control. In April, General Gage received secret orders to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, two prominent leaders of the colonial resistance. He was also tasked with seizing and destroying a cache of weapons reportedly stored by the colonial militia in the town of Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. On the night of April 18, 1775, British troops set out from Boston under the cover of darkness. But colonial spies, including Paul Revere and William Dawes, were already on the move. They rode through the countryside warning that the regulars are coming. Their midnight ride rallied the militias of the surrounding towns. As dawn broke on April 19th, the British troops reached the village of Lexington. There, on the town green, a small group of colonial militiamen had gathered. The British commander ordered them to disperse. They began to do so, but suddenly a shot rang out. No one knows who fired it. But that single, unknown shot became known as the shot heard round the world. The British opened fire and 8 militiamen were killed. The Redcoats pressed on to Concord, where they encountered even stronger resistance. Militiamen had flooded into the area and used guerrilla tactics to ambush the British along the road back to Boston. By the end of the day, nearly 300 British soldiers had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. The war had begun. News of the battles spread rapidly throughout the colonies. Militias mobilized. Men and boys took up arms. Soon more than 20,000 colonial troops surrounded Boston, laying siege to the city. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775 and appointed George Washington, a Virginian and veteran of the French and Indian War, as commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army. The colonists were now fighting a war, but they were not yet fighting for full independence. Many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. The Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, pleading for peace and a return to harmony. But the king refused to receive it. Instead, he declared the colonies to be in open rebellion and called for the suppression of the uprising by force. In June 1775, the British attempted to break the siege of Boston by attacking colonial positions on the Charlestown Peninsula. The resulting Battle of Bunker Hill was a brutal, bloody affair. Though the British ultimately took the ground, they suffered over 1,000 casualties. The colonial forces, though eventually forced to retreat, had stood their ground against the most powerful army in the world. The revolution was no longer just a possibility, it was now a reality, and both sides were preparing for a long and uncertain conflict. As 1776 dawned, the colonies were no longer merely resisting British policies. They were preparing to break away entirely. The war was in full swing. Blood had been spilled, battles fought, and homes destroyed. Still, the idea of full independence remained a bold, almost unthinkable proposition for many. But the winds were changing. In January of that year, a small pamphlet appeared in Philadelphia. Written by an Englishman named Thomas Paine, it was called Common Sense. In clear, impassioned language, Paine argued that it was not only unreasonable, but unnatural for a continent to be ruled by a distant island. He called for complete independence from Britain and the creation of a republic based on democratic principles. Common sense swept through the colonies like wildfire. In an age before mass media, it sold more than 100,000 copies in just a few months. Its influence was immense. For many undecided colonists, it was the tipping point. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress reconvened. On On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution that declared, "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." Debate followed. Some delegates hesitated. Others, like John Adams, argued passionately in favour. A committee was formed to draft a formal declaration. The task of writing it fell primarily to a young Virginian planter and lawyer named Thomas Jefferson. Over the next few days, Jefferson wrote one of the most powerful political documents in history. On July 2nd, the Congress voted in favour of independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they approved Jefferson's final draft. The Declaration of Independence was adopted. Its opening words would echo through centuries. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The Declaration laid out the colony's grievances, condemned King George III, and announced to the world that the 13 colonies were now the United States of America, free, sovereign, and determined. It was a declaration of philosophy, of vision, and of war. As bells rang out in Philadelphia, celebrations erupted. But across the Atlantic, the British Crown saw this not as a declaration of freedom, but of treason. The response would be swift, and the full might of the British Empire was about to be unleashed. The ink on the Declaration of Independence was barely dry when the British response arrived, not as words on a page, but as warships on the horizon. By the summer of 1776, the British Empire had assembled, the largest military expedition it had ever launched across the Atlantic. More than 30,000 soldiers, sailors, and support personnel, many of them German mercenaries known as Hessians, descended upon New York. Their mission was clear: crush the rebellion, reclaim the colonies, and restore British authority. General George Washington, recently appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, knew what was coming. He prepared as best he could, but his army was inexperienced, ill-equipped, and vastly outnumbered. When the British landed on Staten Island and began moving toward Brooklyn, Washington positioned his troops to defend New York. What followed was the Battle of Long Island, the largest battle of the entire war. The Americans fought bravely, but were overwhelmed. The British executed a flanking maneuver under cover of night and fog, catching Washington's forces by surprise. The Continental Army suffered heavy losses, and only a miraculous retreat across the East River, aided by a thick morning fog, saved Washington's army from complete destruction. The loss of New York was devastating. Over the following weeks, the Americans were driven from Manhattan and across New Jersey. Morale plummeted, desertion increased. At times, Washington's army dwindled to just a few thousand men. But in the darkness of despair, Washington planned one of the boldest moves of the war. On Christmas night, 1776, as snow fell and the Delaware River began to freeze, Washington led a surprise attack on a Hessian garrison in Trenton, New Jersey. The march was brutal. Men wore rags around their feet, blood staining the snow. Some carried no shoes at all, but they pressed on. In the early hours of December 26th, they attacked. The Hessians, caught off guard and still recovering from Christmas celebrations, were routed. The victory was small in military terms, but immense in symbolic value. It proved the Continental Army could fight and win. Washington followed up with another victory at Princeton days later, further reinvigorating the cause. The victories in New Jersey shattered the British assumption that the rebellion would collapse under pressure. Instead, they faced an enemy that was determined, adaptable, and led by a commander with remarkable ability to inspire. Still, the war dragged on, and the years that followed would be marked by hardship, brutality, and shifting fortunes. The British launched new campaigns to isolate New England and control the Hudson River Valley. In 1777, British General John Burgoyne led a large force south from Canada, intending to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. But the plan unravelled in the dense forests of upstate New York. As Burgoyne's army advanced, they were slowed by rough terrain and persistent American resistance. Local militias harassed their supply lines, cut down trees to block roads, and engaged in constant skirmishes. The Americans, under the leadership of generals like Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, converged on the British near the village of Saratoga. The resulting battles, fought in September and October of 1777, were decisive. Burgoyne's army was surrounded, outnumbered, and without reinforcements. On October 17th, he surrendered more than 6,000 troops to the Americans. The victory at Saratoga was a turning point, not just militarily, but diplomatically. Across the Atlantic, the French had been watching the conflict closely. The American cause was bold, even romantic, but until now, its chances of success seemed slim. Saratoga changed that. It demonstrated that the Americans could win major battles and that they might truly achieve independence. In 1778, France officially entered the war on the side of the United States. The alliance was a game changer. With French ships, soldiers, money, and supplies, the Americans gained the support of one of Europe's greatest powers. Soon after, Spain and the Dutch Republic also declared war on Britain. What had begun as a colonial rebellion had now escalated into a global conflict. But for all its strategic victories and international alliances, the war remained brutal for those who lived through it. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Families were torn apart not just by violence but by ideology. Neighbours loyal to the crown and others loyal to the revolution found themselves enemies. Towns were burned, crops destroyed, the economy collapsed. Loyalists were driven from their homes, some fleeing to Canada or back to Britain. Slaves were promised freedom by both sides, then often betrayed. Meanwhile, in Valley Forge, during the winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington's army endured unimaginable suffering. Lacking proper food, clothing, and shelter, soldiers died of disease and exposure. Supplies were so scarce that men boiled their leather shoes for soup. Morale teetered on the edge of collapse. Yet, it was during this dark winter that the army was reborn. A Prussian military officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge and began training the troops. He instilled discipline, taught battlefield tactics, and reorganized the army's structure. When spring arrived, Washington's army emerged leaner, better trained, and more capable than ever before. The war was far from over, but the Americans had proven one crucial truth: they would not quit. By 1779, the Revolutionary War had entered a new and uncertain phase. The early hopes of a swift conclusion on either side had faded into the reality of a long, grinding conflict. What had begun as a dispute over taxation and governance had transformed into a struggle for identity, survival, and sovereignty. As the war dragged into its fourth and fifth years, it became increasingly clear that battles alone would not determine the outcome. Instead, the fate of the revolution would hinge on endurance, alliances, and strategic adaptation. The British, frustrated by their inability to win a decisive victory in the northern colonies, turned their focus south. They believed that the South harboured a greater number of loyalists, colonists who remained loyal to the crown, and that a strong military presence there could turn the tide of the war. In late 1778, British forces captured Savannah, Georgia. A year later, They took Charleston, South Carolina, in one of the worst American defeats of the war. Nearly 5,000 American troops were captured. With these victories, the British believed they were on the brink of success. They controlled major ports, had established garrisons, and expected widespread loyalist support to help pacify the countryside. But once again, they had underestimated the resolve and resourcefulness of the American resistance. Rather than fading away, the fight in the South grew fiercer and bloodier. Patriot militias took to the forests, swamps, and back roads, launching hit-and-run attacks on British patrols and supply wagons. Leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, became legends for their ability to strike suddenly and vanish into the wilderness. In these brutal guerrilla-style engagements, the lines between soldier and civilian, between victory and atrocity, often blurred. British General Lord Cornwallis took command of the Southern Campaign. He was a skilled officer, but his army found itself constantly harried by both Continental forces and local militias. In 1780, the Battle of Camden proved another disaster for the Americans, with General Horatio Gates' forces routed and fleeing the field. But soon after, the tide began to turn again. New American leadership emerged in the South. General Nathanael Greene, appointed by Washington to lead the Southern forces, adopted a strategy of strategic retreat and harassment. Greene knew he could not defeat the British in open battle, but he could exhaust them. His forces fought a series of engagements across the Carolinas, drawing Cornwallis deeper into hostile territory. At the same time, decisive battles began to chip away at British momentum. The Battle of Kings Mountain, in October 1780, fought almost entirely by Patriot militias against Loyalist forces, was a stunning American victory. Just a few months later, in January 1781, Daniel Morgan led a mixed force of Continentals and militia to a brilliant tactical win at the Battle of Cowpens. Using a clever double envelopment manoeuvre, Morgan broke the back of British cavalry forces under Banastre Tarleton, whose brutal reputation had galvanised Southern resistance. These victories did more than thin British ranks. They shattered their aura of invincibility. As Cornwallis pushed north through North Carolina and into Virginia, his army was weary, undersupplied, and increasingly isolated. Meanwhile, Greene's forces shadowed them, striking and withdrawing, never letting the British rest. In Virginia, the war's end began to take shape. By 1781, Cornwallis had moved his forces to the coastal town of Yorktown, hoping to rest and resupply. But what he did not anticipate was how rapidly the strategic situation would change. Washington, always watching for an opportunity, saw a chance to strike a decisive blow. With the help of the French Navy under Admiral de Grasse, who sailed north from the Caribbean, Washington coordinated a massive campaign to trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. French forces under General Rochambeau marched alongside the Continental Army in a rare and carefully orchestrated joint campaign. Moving quickly and in secret, they raced south from New York, arriving outside Yorktown in late September. At the same time, the French fleet blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any British hope of escape or reinforcement by sea. What followed was a siege of epic proportions. For nearly 3 weeks, the combined Franco-American forces bombarded British defences. Trenches were dug. Redoubts were stormed. Artillery pounded day and night. Cornwallis, trapped and outnumbered, held on as long as he could. On October 19th, 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered his entire army, more than 7,000 men. The sight of British soldiers laying down their arms to American and French forces was a moment of profound significance. Though fighting would continue in isolated skirmishes, Yorktown effectively ended the Revolutionary War. Back in London, news of the surrender stunned Parliament and the public. Support for the war collapsed. Within months, the British government began peace negotiations. The American Revolution had survived its darkest moments, adapted to shifting strategies, and, against the odds, secured a battlefield victory over one of the greatest empires in history. But the journey to independence was not over. Now came the challenge of diplomacy, of defining a new nation, and of turning ideals into institutions. Even as the guns fell silent at Yorktown, the American Revolution was not yet truly over. Though the final major battle had been fought, peace was a complex, fragile thing, and would not come easily. The British still held New York, Savannah, and Charleston. Armies remained in the field, and neither side had officially conceded anything. Now the revolution entered its final phase, not of muskets and bayonets, but of treaties, envoys, and careful diplomacy. For the American leadership, the task was twofold: secure formal recognition of independence and ensure the new nation's survival through favourable terms. The war had always been as much about legitimacy as it was about liberty. Without formal recognition, the United States risked being dismissed as a failed rebellion, and without secure borders, trade rights, and sovereignty, even victory could turn hollow. The negotiations took place in Paris. Representing the United States were some of the most remarkable minds of the era: Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. These men were not only seasoned diplomats but symbols of the American cause. Franklin, with his wit and charm, had spent years in France securing support and cultivating goodwill. Adams was stern, honest, and fiercely determined. Jay brought clarity, strategy, and caution to the table. At first, the Americans worked alongside their French allies, who had supported the revolution at great cost. But as the negotiations unfolded, it became clear that France's interests did not always align with America's. France, wary of a powerful United States rising too quickly, sought to moderate the terms. Spain, too, had its own ambitions, particularly in acquiring territory like Gibraltar and controlling the Mississippi. Sensing that their allies might complicate rather than simplify the process, the American delegation made a bold move. They began negotiating directly with Britain in secret. This was a gamble, but one that paid off. The British, exhausted by war, political unrest, and the growing cost of empire, were now under a new government that was far more inclined to end the conflict. Prime Minister Lord Shelburne and his ministers understood that the United States was lost, and that maintaining any relationship might be better than none. The result of these private negotiations was the Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3rd, 1783. Its terms were extraordinary. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. The new nation's borders were set with astonishing generosity. From the Atlantic in the east to the Mississippi River in the west, and from Canada in the north to Florida in the south. Britain ceded vast tracts of territory and fishing rights. In return, the Americans agreed to urge the return of confiscated Loyalist property and to pay pre-war debts owed to British creditors. For the Americans, the treaty was more than a diplomatic success. It was the birth certificate of a new country. After 8 years of war, they had won not only their freedom, but the right to shape their own destiny. As news of the treaty spread, celebrations erupted throughout the former colonies. Bells rang, parades marched, prayers were offered in churches. But the jubilation was tempered by a profound sense of uncertainty. The war was over, the British would leave. But now came the even greater challenge: governing a new nation. In November 1783, the last British troops departed New York. Washington led a farewell march through the city, greeted by crowds of cheering Americans. A few weeks later, on December 4th, he met with his officers at Frances Tavern. In a deeply emotional farewell, he thanked them for their service, embraced them one by one, and stepped away from power. It was a moment almost unheard of in history. A victorious general, adored by his people, chose not to seize power, but to retire to private life. Washington returned to Mount Vernon, intending to live out his days as a farmer. His resignation was a powerful statement that America would be a republic, not a monarchy, that its leaders would serve, not rule. But the road ahead was far from smooth. The 13 states, loosely bound by the Articles of Confederation, were deeply divided. The war had left them in debt, with no strong central government, no national currency, and no unified economic policy. Each state acted in its own interests. The Confederation Congress lacked the power to tax, regulate trade, or enforce its laws. Foreign nations watched with skepticism, wondering if the United States would fracture before it could truly unite. Yet the revolutionary spirit endured. The ideals of liberty, equality, and self-governance remained alive in the hearts of millions. Farmers, merchants, veterans, and philosophers all debated what this new republic should be. Was it a democracy? A republic? A federation of sovereign states? These questions would lead in time to rebellion, to the Constitutional Convention, and to the founding documents that still define America today. But in 1783, in that fragile moment between war and peace, the United States was something unprecedented, a nation born not of ancient bloodlines, but of shared principles. It had emerged from fire and struggle, from forests and farmlands, from speeches and sacrifices. And its story, though just beginning, had already changed the world. The revolution was won, but victory did not mean rest. As the echoes of muskets faded and the Union Jack disappeared from American ports, the real test of the revolution began, not on the battlefield, but in the meeting halls, courtrooms, and dusty town squares of a new nation. The United States, born in rebellion, was now responsible for defining itself, organizing its government, and fulfilling the promise it had declared to the world. But in 1783, the path ahead was anything but clear. The new republic was a patchwork of diverse economies, cultures, and priorities. In New England, small towns revolved around churches and local assemblies. In the South, vast plantations dominated the land and depended on the labor of enslaved people. In the Middle States, merchants, artisans, and immigrants shaped a different rhythm of life. Each region had its own traditions, loyalties, and ambitions. What bound them together was thin, an idea more than a system. The Articles of Confederation, adopted during the war, had held the 13 states together in name. But in practice, the national government was weak. It had no power to tax, no authority to regulate commerce between states, no president, and no judiciary. The Congress could pass resolutions, but it had little power to enforce them. Each state printed its own money, levied its own tariffs, and set its own rules. Some even negotiated their own treaties. This loose arrangement might have worked in times of peace and prosperity, but the war had left the country deeply in debt and economically fractured. Trade with Britain had collapsed. Inflation ran rampant. Soldiers returned from war to find their farms seized or their wages unpaid. In the countryside, frustration simmered into rebellion. In western Massachusetts in 1786, a group of veterans and farmers, led by Daniel Shays, rose up against the state government. Burdened by taxes and foreclosure, they marched on courthouses to halt proceedings. The rebellion was put down by a hastily assembled militia, but it sent shockwaves through the young republic. Many feared the government was too weak to preserve order. If local uprisings could challenge state authority, what hope was there for national unity? Among the founding fathers, alarm grew. George Washington, watching from Mount Vernon, warned that the revolution's legacy was at risk. Others, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, called for a stronger federal government. In 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia, not to revise the Articles, as originally planned, but to write something entirely new. The Constitutional Convention was held in secret, behind closed doors, in a sweltering hall during a hot summer. The delegates argued fiercely over representation, the balance of power, and the role of the executive. Large states clashed with small states. Slavery, ever present and ever divisive, loomed over the debates. What emerged from those months of deliberation was the United States Constitution, a document that both centralized power and restrained it. It created a system of checks and balances, a bicameral legislature, an independent judiciary, and an executive branch. It was revolutionary in its design, a government by the people for the people, but with guardrails to prevent tyranny. Still, the Constitution was not universally embraced. Many feared it gave too much power to the central government. The lack of a Bill of Rights was particularly troubling to opponents known as the Anti-Federalists. In response, Federalists like Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of essays, the Federalist Papers, defending the Constitution and urging ratification. Eventually, compromise won the day. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, and the promise of a Bill of Rights soon followed. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first President of the United States. He took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, the first capital, with solemn humility. The nation had taken another step forward, but the ideals of the revolution, liberty, equality, self-government, remained unfinished. Women who had supported the war effort through labor, sacrifice, and even espionage, found themselves largely excluded from political life. Some began to advocate for education and rights, planting the seeds of future movements. African Americans faced an even harsher truth. Thousands had fought for freedom on both sides of the conflict. Some enslaved men joined the British in exchange for promises of emancipation. Others fought for the American cause, hoping the revolution would extend its principles to all. But slavery remained firmly entrenched, especially in the South. The Constitution itself made compromises to protect it, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation and delaying any action on the slave trade for decades. Native American nations, too, saw their hopes dashed. Many had sided with the British, seeing them as a lesser threat to their lands than American settlers. With Britain's defeat, westward expansion accelerated. Treaties were broken, territories seized, and ancient homelands lost. These contradictions did not erase the revolution's significance, but they revealed its limits. The ideals declared in 1776, freedom, justice, equality, were aspirational. The revolution had begun a conversation, not concluded it. Each generation since has revisited those words, asking what they mean, who they include, and how they can be made real. In that sense, the American Revolution never truly ended. It lives on in the nation's laws, in its debates, in its struggles for justice and inclusion. It lives on in every peaceful transfer of power, every protest for civil rights, every vote cast in hope. The revolution was not just a break from empire. It was the beginning of an experiment in self-rule, flawed, ambitious, unfinished. And it remains, to this day, one of the boldest experiments the world has ever known. As the United States stepped into the uncertain world of nationhood, the memory of the revolution began to take on a life of its own. Though it had only recently ended, it was already being mythologized, its heroes enshrined, its battles commemorated, its principles recited like scripture. Across the new republic, people began to shape and reshape the narrative of the war, embedding it into the very identity of what it meant to be American. Monuments rose, paintings were commissioned, poems were written. School books began to tell the story of the revolution not just as a war, but as a sacred origin. A tale of freedom's triumph over tyranny, of a people who dared to rise against an empire. George Washington, once a farmer and soldier, became something larger than life, the father of his country. His image was placed on coins, carved into wood, etched into stone. He became the standard by which all future leaders would be judged. And yet, this process of remembrance was selective. Certain figures were elevated while others were forgotten. Women like Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man to fight in the Continental Army, were largely omitted from the early histories. So too were the contributions of African Americans like James Armistead Lafayette, a spy for the American cause whose intelligence helped ensure victory at Yorktown. The thousands of enslaved people who sought freedom, some aligning with the British, others with the Patriots, were written out of the story, their hopes left unacknowledged. Native American nations, whose lands were lost in the wake of independence, were similarly erased. The revolution had not brought them liberty, but dispossession. And while the new republic claimed ideals of universal freedom, it expanded westward over lands already inhabited by sovereign peoples. Treaties would be made and broken. Wars would be fought. Tribes that had once been pivotal players in the balance of empires found themselves marginalized, then displaced. Still, the revolution remained a powerful touchstone. It offered a set of values that could be interpreted and reinterpreted by future generations. Abolitionists in the 19th century would invoke its language to call for the end of slavery. Women's suffrage advocates would draw on its rhetoric to demand the right to vote. Civil rights leaders would remind the nation that its own founding promised equality for all. In this way, the American Revolution became not just a historical event, but a moral compass, a mirror in which the nation could see both its highest aspirations and its deepest contradictions. The physical remnants of the war, too, became sacred spaces. The fields of Lexington and Concord, the steep slopes of Bunker Hill, the winter huts of Valley Forge. These places drew pilgrims, citizens who came, not for worship, but for reflection, to walk the same ground as those who had once stood against empire, to imagine the sound of drums, the fear in the air, the resolute faces of those who believed in something bigger than themselves. And yet, for all its myth and meaning, the revolution was also a deeply human story. It was a story of farmers who became soldiers, of mothers who became spies, of teenagers who carried messages on horseback through enemy lines. It was a story of broken families, brothers who chose different sides, fathers who never came home. It was a story of uncertainty, sacrifice, and endurance. In the decades that followed, the United States would face trials that would test its foundations: wars, economic collapse, internal division, political strife. But the revolution, flawed and incomplete as it was, provided a foundation, not a perfect one, not a finished one, but a beginning. And beginnings, after all, are rare and sacred things. Today, more than 2 centuries later, the revolution lives on. Not in the form of muskets or powdered wigs, but in the enduring question it posed to the world. Can people govern themselves? Can a society built on liberty endure? That question is still being asked, still being answered, with each election, each protest, each civic act, large or small. And so the revolution continues, not with cannon fire, but with the quiet resolve of a people still striving to live up to the promise of their own founding. A promise forged in rebellion, written in idealism, tested in blood. A promise that whispers through the centuries. We, the people. The American Revolution, while a singular moment in the history of the United States, did not exist in a vacuum. Its reverberations were felt far beyond the shores of the 13 colonies. In Europe, in the Caribbean, and in Latin America, observers watched the experiment with fascination, anxiety, and hope. The revolution set a precedent that the common people, not kings or parliaments, might claim the right to rule themselves. That freedom, once an abstract ideal, could be transformed into a functioning republic. In France, those ideals found fertile ground. Just a few years after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the streets of Paris itself echoed with the cries of revolution. The French Revolution, though far more radical and tumultuous, drew deeply from the American experience. French soldiers and officers who had fought alongside the Americans, like the Marquis de Lafayette, returned home inspired, believing that liberty and equality were not just words, but possibilities. The language of the American Declaration of Independence found its way into the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The idea that power derived from the consent of the governed began to shape revolutions not just in Europe, but in colonies around the world. But the American Revolution also carried contradictions that would echo across generations and continents. For all its talk of liberty, the United States emerged from the war as a nation that tolerated, and in many places, depended on, slavery. The very men who signed the Declaration of Independence included slaveholders. This glaring inconsistency did not go unnoticed. Abolitionist movements both in America and abroad seized on that contradiction, using it as a call to action. If all men were created equal, then how could slavery continue? Similarly, the revolution inspired enslaved people in the Caribbean. In Haiti, the world's first successful slave revolt erupted in 1791, just years after American independence. Led by Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian Revolution would ultimately succeed in overthrowing French colonial rule and establishing a free Black Republic, the first of its kind in the modern world. But while the American Revolution had helped light that fire, it did not always embrace its spread. The US, fearful of slave rebellions within its own borders, grew uneasy about revolutionary movements in its hemisphere. The ideals of liberty, it seemed, were often hemmed in by the realities of race, class, and political power. Nonetheless, the global impact of the American Revolution was undeniable. It inspired constitutional movements in Poland, independence wars across Latin America, and new political philosophies in Britain and beyond. Even monarchs began to reconsider how they governed. The revolution demonstrated that a people could organize themselves, resist imperial authority, and create something lasting, something rooted not in divine right, but in human reason and collective will. Back home, Americans began to see their revolution not just as a national triumph, but as a beacon for the world. This belief, sometimes sincere, sometimes self-serving, would shape American foreign policy for centuries. The US would come to see itself as a model, and at times a missionary of democratic ideals. Yet the balance between principle and practice remained delicate. Throughout the 19th century, As America expanded westward, it often did so at the expense of indigenous nations, using the same rhetoric of destiny and liberty to justify conquest and dispossession. The ideals of the revolution, so stirring in theory, were continually tested by the realities of power. And still, the revolution endured, not as a fixed event, but as a living dialogue. It became the standard against which America measured itself, a touchstone invoked in times of trial. During the Civil War, both the Union and Confederacy claimed to be defending the true spirit of 1776. During World War II, American leaders framed the fight against fascism as a continuation of the struggle for freedom begun in the colonies. In the civil rights movement, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. held the Declaration of Independence as a promissory note, a vision not yet fulfilled, but one worth pursuing. The American Revolution was not perfect. It left many behind. It fell short of its own ideals in countless ways, but its power lies in that very tension. It declared that freedom was not a gift from monarchs, but a right inherent to all. It argued that governments derived their legitimacy not from lineage, but from the governed. And it dared to imagine a society based not on inherited privilege, but on participation, representation, and reason. That idea continues to evolve. It is debated, contested, and redefined by each generation. And that is perhaps the revolution's greatest legacy. Not that it was completed, but that it is never complete. By the close of the 18th century, the American Revolution had concluded in terms of war and treaties, but its spirit was just beginning to echo through time. The generation that had fought for independence found itself in the role of founders, tasked with translating the ideals they had bled for into the mechanisms of everyday governance. This transition from revolutionaries to statesmen was not a simple one. The challenges were immediate and complex. The country's infrastructure was weak. Roads were poor, communications slow, and regional loyalties often stronger than national identity. The concept of America still felt new, even abstract. Most people's primary allegiance was to their state, their town, their local community. It would take time and shared experience for a unified national identity to take root. Even within the newly formed government, divisions quickly emerged. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, favoured a strong central government, robust financial institutions, and close ties with Britain for trade. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, envisioned a more agrarian republic with power remaining closer to the states and the people. These ideological rifts, while framed as policy disagreements, were in many ways continuations of the debates that had existed during the revolution itself. What does liberty mean? How should power be balanced? This tension gave birth to America's first political parties, and to the long, often contentious tradition of partisan politics. Yet it also reflected something healthy and essential: the belief that governance must always be questioned, discussed, and, when necessary, challenged. This belief was the heartbeat of the revolution, carried forward into the peacetime life of the Republic. Meanwhile, the early 1800s saw the country expand rapidly. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the United States. Westward expansion was seen by many as the fulfillment of the Revolution's promise: land, opportunity, and the extension of liberty. But this expansion came at a devastating cost. Native American nations were displaced, treaties were ignored or broken, and a cycle of violence and removal began that would continue for generations. Here again, the revolution's legacy was double-edged. The idea of freedom had inspired independence, but it was now being used to justify conquest. Americans spoke of manifest destiny, the belief that their republic was destined to expand from coast to coast, but often overlooked the people whose lives and lands were consumed by that expansion. And still, the revolution continued to inspire. New generations born after the war looked to the founding ideals as both compass and measuring stick. In schoolhouses, children memorized the Declaration of Independence. In public discourse, leaders quoted the Founding Fathers. The revolution became the story the country told about itself. A story of courage, resilience, and righteousness. But storytelling, like memory, is selective. The revolution's darker complexities, its exclusions, its compromises, its contradictions, were often smoothed over or forgotten. The experiences of enslaved people, of women, of Native Americans, and of poor labourers were marginalised in the official narrative. Their stories would be reclaimed only slowly, through the voices of historians, poets, and activists determined to widen the lens. The mid-19th century brought the nation to another crisis, and once again, the legacy of the revolution loomed large. As the debate over slavery tore the country apart, both sides invoked the founding era. Abolitionists pointed to the revolution's ideals of liberty and equality, demanding they be fulfilled at last. Pro-slavery advocates argued they were defending the sovereignty of states, the same principle the colonies had fought for against the British Crown. When the Civil War broke out, President Abraham Lincoln framed the conflict as a second American Revolution. In the Gettysburg Address, he famously spoke of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He called on Americans to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That language echoed the words of 1776 and reminded the country that the revolution was not a one-time event, but an ongoing challenge. The century that followed would continue to test and redefine what the revolution meant. Women demanded the right to vote and achieved it in 1920, nearly 150 years after the Declaration of Independence. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s drew directly from the revolution's moral force, insisting that the country live up to its founding promises. Marches, speeches, sit-ins, and court battles were fought not against the idea of America, but for the deeper fulfillment of it. Each time the country looked back to that revolutionary beginning, not as a static moment, but as a foundation. Today, the revolution is remembered in many ways, in textbooks and monuments, in fireworks on the 4th of July, in debates on the meaning of freedom and responsibility, in the quiet pride of casting a ballot, in the public forums where citizens still gather to shape their communities. Its influence is found not only in history books, but in the daily workings of democracy. And through all this, one truth remains. The American Revolution was not just a fight for independence. It was a declaration of human potential. It said that ordinary people, with all their flaws and fears, could rise up against injustice. That they could imagine a different world, and then build it. That they could, in moments of both great courage and quiet conviction, change the course of history. The revolution endures, not because it was perfect, but because it dared to begin something extraordinary. As the story of the American Revolution draws to a close, we find ourselves not at an ending, but at a reflection point. A chance to look back, not just on battles and declarations, but on the ideas, tensions, and legacies that continue to shape the world today. What began in town halls and taverns, in whispered conversations and printed pamphlets, grew into a movement that reshaped the very concept of governance. The revolution was a leap into the unknown. It asked whether a people could truly govern themselves without monarchs or inherited power. It questioned old hierarchies, rewrote political relationships, and dared to imagine a republic built on liberty, consent, and law. And yet, the revolution was never about purity. It was, from the beginning, a collision of ideals and realities. Its leaders spoke of universal rights while enslaving fellow human beings. They proclaimed equality while excluding women, indigenous nations, and the poor from the halls of power. These contradictions did not invalidate the revolution. They revealed the magnitude of the journey still to come. For the revolution's power lies not in perfection, but in potential. It planted ideas that outgrew their time. Words like freedom and justice that were once constrained by race, gender, and property have been stretched by generations who refuse to let those words remain hollow. Each time those ideals were denied, someone rose to demand them. Each time the promise was narrowed, someone worked to expand it. And in that ongoing work, the revolution lives on. It lives in every courtroom where rights are defended, in every classroom where young minds wrestle with history, in every vote cast, every protest raised, every effort to make the nation more just and more free. The men and women of the revolution did not know what their struggle would become. They did not foresee a world where their words would be studied by people centuries later. Many of them never lived to see the fruits of their labour, but they left behind something enduring, the idea that people could shape their own destinies, that governments should answer to the governed, that the arc of history, though jagged and uneven, could bend towards something better. And perhaps that is the revolution's greatest gift, not a set of answers, but a set of questions. What does freedom look like? Who gets to share in it? What are we willing to sacrifice for it? How do we live up to the words we so easily celebrate? These questions echo still, long after the last cannon faded into silence, long after the treaties were signed and the flags changed hands. So as we drift deeper into sleep and the soft shadows of history settle in, remember that the revolution was not only about soldiers or generals, not only about redcoats or minute men. It was about people, flawed, passionate, frightened, and brave, who chose to believe in something larger than themselves. And in that choice, they left us a legacy far more powerful than any document or battlefield. They left us the challenge and the privilege of continuing the story.